Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
The king has fled London. Charles has taken flight. John Pym has consolidated power in the city. And civil war is inevitable. There would never be an autocratic monarch in England again. We've been looking at the reign of Charles I of England. The goal has been to develop his reign in these years for the express purpose of better understanding colonial America. I've tried to keep the whole thing pretty brief, but we do want to understand that most of what we have covered in this short series was coinciding with the development of Puritan New England. And these years in England influenced the colonies. They also enjoyed a liberty throughout the 1630s that they may not have enjoyed if the king was able to work with Parliament. We have a little more to go to our story, but I want to remind everybody that this series is not meant to be exhaustive. It's meant to shed light on the colonial activity, as well as the reorganization of the colonies at the time of the Restoration. So we've got a couple of more episodes in this little side series. Today, I want to develop the Civil War years from a political standpoint. We're going to cover a lot of ground. Just keep the goal in mind. I don't want to take the time to develop the military side of the Civil Wars. What I do want to do is develop the political environment that led to the rise of Oliver Cromwell, the murder of Charles, and the failure of the Commonwealth. These events will lead us to the restoration of the House of Stuart. And once we get there, we'll jump back across the Atlantic and see what the colonies were up to when it came to the murder of Charles and the consequences. So I'll be painting with a broad brush. And I hope I don't leave too much out of the narrative. We could do dozens of episodes on the English Civil Wars. For our purposes, this may be like 3 or 4 mini episodes with kind of seamless breaks between them and a little bit of overlap of the layers. In the end, I think we'll have a pretty good idea of the politics. So Charles had fled, but there were ongoing negotiations. Of course, neither side was willing to budge, and both sides were shoring up their support. The Parliamentarians came to be known as Roundheads due to their short, bull-like haircuts. The Royalists were known as Cavaliers. That was a title after Shakespeare's play Henry IV, which was used to describe an obnoxious member of the gentry. And they're not to be confused with the Scottish Covenanters. There's a lot of moving parts here. One Roundhead described the division between the sides this way, quote, "The question in dispute between the king's party and us was whether the king should govern as God by his will, and the nation be governed by force like beasts, or whether the people should be governed by laws made by themselves and live under a government derived from their own consent," end quote. Although Charles believed in his divine right to rule, he claimed to embrace a constitutional monarchy. It was said that one party desired Parliament not without the king, and the other the king not without Parliament. And those two positions were miles apart. So on the 1st of June, 1642, Parliament presented Charles with the 19 propositions. In short, it demanded the council, the king's great officers of state, as well as his children's tutors, to be appointed by Parliament. Parliament would also be in charge of the military forces, both the militia and the army that would be needed to deal with the Irish and Scottish forces. And lastly, there was that pesky subject of religious matters, which Parliament would also claim control of. Now, do you think Charles went for that? No, of course not. Frankly, if this was Parliament's position, maybe they weren't negotiating in good faith. The country was very divided, town against town, family against family, family members against family members, just like the American Civil War 200 years later. And frankly, it was just as costly for England, Scotland, and Ireland. The Puritans had Parliament and London. They had most of the ports and manufacturing centers, along with the merchant and business class. The Royalists consisted of the nobility and the high churchmen who had the court, and they controlled the northern and the western part of the country, including Wales. The Roundheads' original claim was that they were not against the king so much as his advisors. They were trying to rescue Charles from bad counsel. Where would your loyalties have been back then? Based on what we know so far, because the sides are being picked right now. As we'll see, the Puritans would do no better, probably worse than Charles had once they were in charge. But anyway, from the beginning, Parliament took a hard stand for their ambitions, so hard that it actually helped the Royalist cause. It's just like our contemporary politics in the United States of America. A lot of people that vote in national elections seem to be voting against a candidate rather than for a candidate. And look where that's gotten us. So as the sides solidified their positions, Charles was in charge of the Royalist faction. The Earl of Essex was the first commander-in-chief for the Parliamentarian forces. The whole thing was pretty clunky. I mean, think about this. England had been at peace on the island for about 50 years, except for their limited involvement on the continental causes. And this generation may not have been the most learned in the art of war or military affairs. The Royalists did have the upper hand initially, but there were setbacks. The weapons to be used against the Scots had been stored at Hull. When Charles tried to retrieve those weapons, he was turned away and denied those weapons. And that must have just enraged him. Now, eventually, Hull would come back to Charles's side. Anyway, that summer, he made his way to Nottingham, and by October, Charles had recruited 2,000 horses and 6,000 foot soldiers to his cause. And along with that, the Queen came through in a big way. Remember, she had gone abroad to gather arms. Well, she sold some jewelry to the Dutch and secured arms and trained officers from Holland. It's odd to me. The Dutch were so similar to the English and had a lot in common. So that help would make sense. But they were also anti-monarch. I mean, you'd think they would have backed Parliament. Well, those supplies arrived at York, which was no easy task. The Navy had remained loyal to Parliament, except Bristol, which gave Charles control of the Bristol Channel. And money poured in from the nobility as well. For their part, the Roundheads were financed by London. In the same time frame as Charles, they trained 25,000 men. And what they lacked in training, they made up for in emotional engagement. The London militia, the guys that had ultimately backed John Pym, was actually in better shape. They were trained by German instructors. So heading into Q4 of 1642, the sides were drawn and the troops were raised. And I want to avoid too much name dropping because developing those men would take us way off course and would require a deeper dive into the military apparatus. But at least initially, the leadership of both sides were, for the Roundheads, Lord Fairfax, Thomas Fairfax, the previously mentioned Earl of Essex, and Sir William Waller. Eventually, Oliver Cromwell will be the only name you need to know. For the Royalists, Charles, obviously, Sir Ralph Hopton, Prince Maurice and Prince Rupert, and the Marquis of Newcastle. The lines were drawn, and the first major battle on English soil was the Battle of Edge Hill in October of 1642. One thing that became obvious was that nobody had a clear advantage at this point, but it did kick off almost a decade of violence that shook all three nations to the core: England, Scotland, and Ireland. Because we're not going to get too much into the actual battles, let's just consider the carnage that was to come. And the numbers can be disputed. I mean, they're hard to actually nail down from this time frame conclusively. But England and Wales would suffer 85,000 men in combat casualties, 127,000 non-combat deaths, and 40,000 civilians. Scotland and Ireland, representing only a fraction of the population of England, had significant losses as well. Scotland lost 15,000 civilians. Ireland, 137,000 civilians. 137,000. We'll talk about that next week. So roughly 200,000 civilian deaths in total, or about 2.5% of the population. That's staggering. Statistically, this was the worst conflict in the history of the British Isles. So by year's end, both sides claimed 60 to 70,000 fighting men. And Charles was at Oxford. He enjoyed the support of the North and the West and Wales, and eventually, after 1643, Ireland. The next battle that we want to consider is the Battle of Marston Moor on the 2nd of July, 1644, the largest and bloodiest battle of the war. This represented a huge loss for the king's cause. Rupert and the Marquis were humiliated. However, Charles was enjoying a bit of success in the south. The French ambassador at the time, Sabran, spent some time with Charles. that summer in the South, and he praised him and his ability to lead. So there's that. In May, Charles evaded the armies of both Essex and Waller at Oxford. And that summer, he managed to outflank and outmaneuver both men, all the while crushing Waller in June and Essex in September. He took captives and a lot of equipment. And later that year, Parliament went hotter and heavier against Charles, who was holding his own again, now in the West. Never mind the losses up north. But here, Waller and Manchester were given support by Oliver Cromwell. And in late October, there was another battle that resolved nothing. But as the fighting season drew to a close, Charles could draw back satisfied with his campaign that year. The big thing here is, here enters Oliver Cromwell to our narrative. And for the sake of our story, our main character from here on out, or at least for the time being, he was and remains a big deal. I'll be honest, he's another one of these historical figures that our generation may owe a debt of gratitude to, but I'm not his biggest fan. We have to judge these guys in the context of their world, not ours. One could argue the whole of the Western world benefited from Cromwell's accomplishments, but as we'll see, he did not die a popular man, and even in death, he remained in the public eye. So before we develop the life of Oliver Cromwell, at least a little, it's important to understand that he did not enter the Civil War years as a national figure. He rose during these years, seizing opportunity where he could and creating it where he had to. I do admire his moxie. He learned on the job. He learned quickly, and he was effective. So anyway, Cromwell returned from the battlefield to Parliament quite disgusted with how the parliamentarian forces had conducted themselves. The army was not one coordinated unit with a central command. It was more regional and self-made, like nobility-controlled armies. Cromwell envisioned a more centrally controlled army. Essex and Manchester were not the guys to lead that. Cromwell proposed a new model army. At the same time, Parliament's House of Commons pushed for a self-denying ordinance, which prohibited members of Parliament, Lords or Commons, from active military service. The Lords might not have liked it, but the war was not going well. The Scots did not like this either. They didn't like Cromwell, but everybody wanted to win. So Essex and Manchester were finished, and the army was recreated that winter in the vision of Oliver Cromwell. It was to be a centrally planned and funded army. The forces that had been raised by the personal efforts of the nobility were reconstituted into 11 regiments of 600 horses, 12 regiments of foot soldiers, 1,200 strong, 1,000 dragoons, for a total of 22,000 men. The big thing here is that these men had signed up for a certain type of service, and now we're going to provide another. And there was also compulsory service, not too popular. In one instance, 3 conscriptions from Suffolk between April and September of 1645 netted 149 men. Now get this. They had to be brought in by a force of 134 guards. It seemed to everybody that this strong-arm tactic would fail in the end, but it didn't. The thing was that this new model army was under the control of more seasoned men who knew how to lead and had a united religious fervor to their efforts. Thomas Fairfax was named commander-in-chief, and Cromwell, by the self-denying ordinance, was supposed to be out because he's a member of Parliament. But that apparently didn't apply to him. The thing is, he had skill and tenacity that the current situation required. And there's that concept of expediency once again. When a government is pushed to the limits and they're the law of the land, they can do things outside of the lines of the legal system, can't they? It's expedient. It's for the betterment of the nation. It's for the security of the people. So even Cromwell's rivals accepted the fact that he was necessary. It's pretty slick, really. You drive a solution in which you're the only one who can make it work. The malcontents had to be put in their place, and the army needed to move. Oliver Cromwell had proven himself to be a great cavalry leader. And so in June of 1645, he was appointed Lieutenant General of the Horse. Now, this is an important post because he got a lot out of his men. And so he became the only guy that had military command and was a member of Parliament. That's a lot of accumulated power and influence. And with the reorganized, unified, centralized force under his influence, keep that in mind. You don't need the majority. You need control of the levers of power. Cromwell had learned that lesson well. So as a side note, because we did talk about Bishop Laud and because he was one of the reasons for the current Civil War, he was at this time executed. Even the divided goals and sentiments of the Scots, the Roundheads, and the Puritans could agree on this. So Oliver Cromwell becomes the focal point. And let's talk about him a little bit. He was an impressive character, but he was a monster. Ask the Irish. Ask the many, many like-minded Puritans that crossed him. Friend or foe alike, if you aroused his sense of paranoia, he would take you out. A book that I've mentioned before, The Life and Death of Christopher Love by Don Kistler, highlights some of the controversy around Cromwell from within his own camp. From the start, my opinion is not an isolated one. It's not unusual. Cromwell was both celebrated and hated. He was feared and reviled. And in the end, he was tried and executed posthumously. So he was born in 1599 near Cambridge and lived a pretty modest life until the 1640s. He was educated at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge. And this had a lifelong impact on him. There was a very strong Puritan influence under the direction of Samuel Ward, who was a well-known Calvinist. And when his father died, Oliver returned home to support his mother and multiple sisters. I think he had like 6 or 7 sisters. He was a minor landowner, he was a farmer, and he also was a rent collector from tenant farmers. He did study law for a while, and he married pretty well. Elizabeth's father was knighted. He was a merchant, and he owned a lot of land. He also had ties to the Puritan upper class in Essex. So we can easily trace his influencers. It was the decade of the 1630s when the Oliver Cromwell that history remembers began to emerge. This was the decade of his spiritual awakening. He embraced Puritanism and eventually settled in Ely in 1636 upon inheriting some property, which raised his standing in society. This was the same time frame, don't forget, that Charles was enjoying his personal rule. And Cromwell became an MP, but he wasn't like a star. It's not like he was the second coming of John Pym or anything. The Civil War made him. When hostilities broke out, he was a Roundhead. He rose in the ranks of the Parliamentarian forces, and by 1645, he was the number 2 guy in the New Model Army. The New Model Army won a big battle on the 4th of June in 1645, and they kept on rolling to victory over and over and over again until the 6th of May in 1646, when Charles surrendered to the Scots at Newark. And subsequently, Charles was imprisoned at Hampton Court Palace, which, by the way, he would escape from, only to be caught soon after and transferred to Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. The Scots had signed an agreement with Parliament in September of 1643, the Solemn League and Covenant. And they had seen the Royalist successes in early 1643 and the Irish help. Now, there was a lot of symmetry between the Parliamentarians and the Scottish Presbyterians, so they hedged their bets. But they got a good deal. Parliament would pay their expenses, and in return, the Scots obtained 3 things. So Parliament's paying their expenses, and then the Scots obtained 3 things. Think about that. Presbyterianism would be established in England. Doctrinally, they're not far off from the Puritans. They would have a stake in the government, and there would be the continuance of the monarchy, a Scottish monarchy, not a republic. Now, this really helped in the war effort, but as you can imagine, this was not a popular agreement in England. They paid the bills, and Scotland gained a lot. They would, of course, be sending 21,000 troops. Their presence did make the difference at Marston Moor. The Irish did come, but they were not as beneficial to Charles as the Scots were to Parliament. Now, the flip side of the parliamentarian arrangement was the fact that the Catholic Irish Army did not sit very well in England. So to me, the common guy in England on either side of this conflict seems like they had to hold their nose and support their side over the other. Does that sound familiar in current American politics? Well, while we're mentioning the Scots and the Irish, as a side note, things weren't going so well in these countries either. Beginning in early 1639 through May of 1652, Scotland had its own civil war. The Covenanters against the Scottish Royalists. It was the Royalists who were successful for quite a while, until Philip Hogg in September of 1644. Meanwhile, in Ireland, they fought a civil war as well, remembered as the Confederate Wars, fought from 1642 to 1649. This war pitted the Catholics of the Confederates against James Butler, the Earl of Ormond, and the king's Protestant forces. So you've got civil war in England and the government basically falling apart. And you've got civil war in Scotland, although they're helping England with their civil war. And then you've got civil war in Ireland, and they're helping England with their civil war. I mean, this is a mess. Basically, all hell had broken loose in all three countries. The Second Civil War saw the Scots actually back Charles. In December of 1647, Charles signed the Engagement, which called for the establishment of Presbyterianism in England. There you go. They're still looking for Presbyterianism to be established in England. So under this arrangement, for 3 years, they'd get Presbyterianism in England. I guess that they figured that saved them in their own country. And in return, the Scots would help Charles regain the throne. I mean, they did want, the Scottish monarchy. Of course, he was also in negotiations with the Puritans in Parliament for his return at the same time. But the secret talks with the Scots were found out by Oliver Cromwell, who had been negotiating with Charles. At this point, Cromwell was obviously frustrated, saw the futility in these negotiations, or at least the insincerity, and gave up. When you think about it, all sides were really just out for themselves. So in 1648, the Scots invaded England, and they were beaten back on the 17th of August at the Battle of Preston. Cromwell defeated forces loyal to Charles. It was the Second Civil War in 1648 that Cromwell's star really rose. His political clout rose too. Pym had been gone for a long time at this point, years. By late 1648, a split had arisen among the MPs, and some wanted to return the king. Cromwell was on the side that didn't. And by this time, however, the debate had gone farther. Cromwell's group wanted the king tried and convicted for treason and killed. So it all had come down to this. After all the years of personal rule and all the personal insults Charles had been responsible for, whether you like him or not, he had ticked off Parliament, the general Protestant English population with his marriage, a good chunk of the nobility with taxes, the common folks with the whole saltpeter thing, the Scots with the common book of prayer, the Irish, and the new Parliament. His enemies were finally brave enough, finally emboldened enough to actually make the decision that he had to die. And by enemy, I mean the New Model Army and its leadership. And the leader of the New Model Army and leadership was Oliver Cromwell. After all the years of fighting, many people started to see what might lie ahead. Many started to switch sides and look to reinstate the king. The New Model Army, however, saw things differently. They believed that their battlefield successes were proof of God's divine blessing, and they doubled down on their mission. I want to read a couple of quotes from Winston Churchill about this time frame. He does a pretty good job of giving us the essence of really what was going on, what was the temperature and the atmosphere that these folks were living under. He says, quote, "The Second Civil War was very different in cause and conditions from the first. The parts played by almost all the principals were altered or even reversed. Again, like the Scots, switching sides. The king and his prerogative were now seen not as obstacles to parliamentary right, but as the repository of ordinary English freedom. Are you understanding this? The tide had turned. A large proportion of the members of the Long Parliament and almost all the House of the Lords, if they had been allowed to meet, would have expressed this view." Now, that's a small word, if, but it's a key word. So let's pay attention, not just with these quotes, but moving forward towards the end of this podcast. If they had been allowed to meet. Continuing on, the Scots, formerly so exacting against the king, were now convinced that their peril lay in the opposite quarter, the New Model Army. Wales was solid in its royalism. London, formerly the main prop of Pym and Hampton, was now deeply inclined to a restoration of the royal authority. The apprentices, you remember, leaving Churchill for a moment, those young apprentices that John Pym had amped up so eloquently, the drunken follies of youth, the disillusionment, the malleability of conviction and of conscience and of action in those young men so far from home in a strange city. So anyways, Churchill said that those apprentices who had hounded Charles out of the capital still rioted in their exuberance, but now they insulted the soldiery and cried, "Long live the king!" Half the navy, hitherto a deadly weapon against Charles, mutinied in his favor. Most of the ships involved sailed off to Holland and entreated the Prince of Wales to become their admiral. All the royalist forces, smarting, bleeding in pocket and in person, outraged in sentiment and social interest, were eager to draw the sword. The mass of the people still remained comparatively inert. There was not at this moment the universal passion which produced the Restoration of 1660, but all the leading forces in English society were moving together. And even in the mass, the feeling prevailed that the king and Parliament had been swept aside by a new tyranny, which could bring bad times to the toilers. Prisoner at Carisbrooke, Charles was now more truly king than he had ever been in the palmiest days of his personal rule. End quote. Churchill goes on to say, the story of the Second Civil War is short and simple. King, lords and commons, landlords and merchants, the city and the countryside, bishops and presbyters, the Scottish army, the Welsh people, and the English fleet all now turned against the New Model Army. And the army beat the lot. End quote. And just one more quickly here. Quote, by the end of 1648, all was over. Cromwell was dictator. The royalists were crushed. Parliament was a tool. The Constitution was a figment. The Scots were rebuffed. The Welsh back in their mountains. The fleet was reorganized. London overawed. King Charles at Carisbrooke Castle. End quote. So the victory of the New Model Army was not necessarily a victory for England, after all. It was a victory for 20,000 fighting men, well-regulated, fighting fractions of the totality of their opposition, divide and conquer, right? They beat their opponents and they took control. Charles was eventually led back to London for his trial. Even this was a choreographed event. After repeated attempts to reason with Charles about his future, the Puritans gave up. Henry Ireton was the main architect of the Remonstrance. He's also Cromwell's son-in-law. So at any rate, Henry Ireton was the main architect of the Remonstrance that called for the trial of the king and the abolition of the monarchy. This was November 1648. And the following month, in December of 1648, the New Model Army descended on London. When the Parliamentarians tried to take their seats, they were divided by whether they could be counted on to vote the right way or the wrong way. 45 members of the House of Commons were arrested as they entered. It did not go so well for hundreds of others. In fact, a majority of the 500 plus members, 300 would not take their seats at all. Now, we think that the January 6th storming of our Capitol in 2021 was a big deal. Think about what was going on in London in December of 1648, when more than half of the basically federal government was turned away. And a pretty good portion of them were actually arrested as they just attempted to show up and do their due diligence. And there was no precedent for what lay ahead. They tried to find something, anything that could be used to justify their case, and they failed. So they were determined to kill a king who was actually supported by most of the country, who had a son that would inherit his throne, as well as followers. Didn't matter. Their minds were set. The die was cast. The deed would be done. At his trial, Charles was charged with treason. And this is where it gets interesting to me. This is like a story within the story. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority. He would not enter a plea. So the court found him guilty and sentenced him to death. It must have been quite a spectacle, this whole charade for almost 2 months. I mean, nobody was horribly excited about what was coming. Well, Oliver St. John and Henry Vane were pretty excited, at least for a while. But Cromwell himself was still a little hesitant. He knew the legal standing was non-existent. Even very late in December, he still referred to those moving to remove Charles as traitors. I mean, his own son-in-law had written the Remonstrance. But he did come around. Maybe William Shakespeare and Geddy Lee were right. All the world is truly a stage, and we do altogether seem to be but players. There was a special court of 135 high commissioners assembled, with some notable absentees. Fairfax skipped the whole affair. When they called for his name in attendance, they received a response from his wife, Lady Fairfax, who replied, quote, no nor will he be here. He has more wit than to be here. And oddly, Oliver St. John, the once enthusiastic cheerleader, was absent as well. Sometimes an idea sounds good, it sounds more appealing, it sounds better than the reality of obtaining the goal. So, on the 20th of January, 1649, Charles was told he was to be arraigned for, quote, all treasons, murders, ravages, burnings, spoils, dissolutions, damages, and mischiefs to this nation, end quote. Did you catch that? He was to bear the total burden. Based on the current sentiments in the nation right now, how do you think that played out long term? Was this fair? I mean, whether you like or agree with Charles, was he really solely responsible for all that had transpired? I mean, we've been looking at this from a slanted anti-Charles view, but he had always had his supporters, and even Cromwell knew they were on very faulty grounds for prosecution and execution. There was no precedent for this particular regicide. By this time, most of the rest of the populations of England, Ireland, and Scotland had gone over to his side. There's a lesson here for us today as well. It's imperative that we don't get so caught up in beating the political opponent that we miss the danger posed by our side if they achieve their stated agenda. There is precedent for much of the political activity we're experiencing today. Socially, culturally, economically, precedent, historical data, observable realities that may come to pass or can be avoided. Precedent that is reliably accurate as to what may follow, what may prove to be very detrimental to our great republic. Tearing away the foundations of the organized constitutional republic that we have will not, cannot end well for the masses, many of whom are only acting on the emotion of the current crisis, whatever that may be, whoever ginned that up, the zeitgeist, being led by the power of headlines and half-truths, which can have such a strong appeal, whose true danger will only be recognized all too late. Anyway, for these guys in their day, that prevailing minority view was only upheld by the edge of a sword. Was this fair? Was it just? Does Charles appear to be more of a tragic figure in the purest sense the farther we move along in the narrative? In my opinion, 100 years prior, Charles may have had a completely different reputation. Although he may not have withstood the prowess of the Tudors and all of their craftiness, even in his day, on the continent, as it were. Anyway, I said from the start, Charles seems to me to be a man born out of due time. When we think of his concept of monarchy, we have to consider it not from our vantage point in a contemporary political and economic sense, but in theirs. He was not as out of step as it would seem, and the people were beginning to recognize that. So he refused to plead the charges against him, instead challenging the whole affair by asking, quote, by what power am I called hither? I would know by what authority, lawful. For there are many unlawful authorities in the world, thieves and robbers in the highways. Remember, I am your king, your lawful king, and what sins you bring upon your heads, and the judgment of God you bring to this land, think well upon it, before you go further from one sin to a greater. End quote. So basically, he said, I want to know who the authority is that actually would put me on trial. Because there's a lot of people claiming authority all over the world. And in certain segments, maybe they have it for a while, but they're not legitimate. The reality is, I'm the legitimate king. You're sinning against me and the people. Bear that in mind. Because whatever you're going to do now, it won't bring about anything better moving forward. It's got a point. 2 days later, on the 22nd of January, Charles had a written statement prepared. And in it, he asserted his divine right to monarchy. And he also reiterated the challenge that this court was legal. After all, they had claimed to be doing the people's work and will. Yet, Charles had hoped to point out that the general population was now on his side and the rump parliament was basically hand-selected by his enemies. So again, where was the authority? Where's the legitimacy? But they didn't even let him read his statement. And after the 23rd of January, he was resigned to the order of the court. And on the 27th of January, he was found guilty and sentenced to death by the, quote, severing of his head from his body, end quote. And a final time, he was denied the ability to speak. The death warrant was signed by 59 men, only 59, a very small sliver of Parliament. Cromwell and Ireton were among the signers. These were the regicides, the killers of a monarch, murderers, assassins, come in the name of the state. Charles was given 3 days to get his affairs in order. He was taken to Whitehall Palace, the same palace he had fled from years earlier. The next day, he was taken to St. James Palace. He refused to see anyone but his chaplain and his children. Now remember, Henrietta Maria was out of the country, exiled, as were most of his children. But he did spend time with his two youngest. Henry, the Duke of Gloucester, he was 9, and Princess Elizabeth, she was 11. Now here's where the human side, the fatherly side, the heroic side, the brave side of Charles breaks through to me. Yes, he was a pain in the butt, but he was a man and had made human mistakes. But here we can see the inner character, perhaps the heart of the tragic king. Consider these things against how you may behave, how you may present yourself to family and oppressor alike in a time such as this. I mean, it must have been a touching moment. It was reported that Elizabeth cried and Charles hid his tears to comfort her. According to her diary, he said, quote, "Sweetheart, you will forget this," end quote. He told them not to grieve and to obey their older brother Charles, the lawful king in his absence. It was the 29th of January. Now, I've thought about this. Have you? What would you do? What would you say to your children under this type of stress? I mean, let's slow down and work through this. What would you share with them? What wisdom or advice would be most important? What would you want them to know? Would the simple act of comfort be enough? Need there be more? I mean, think about this. How would you want them to remember you? It would, at this late hour, be too late to instill any real wisdom. But you could instill comfort and courage. You could impact their outlook and sense of value as individual, salient people. You could endear them to you emotionally for a lifetime. Because as Charles told Elizabeth, she'd forget. Maybe not the sting in the sense of loss, but the needless details. His goal was to encourage her to move forward, to prosper where she could, not to let this land like an albatross around her neck. Wouldn't you want this for your children too? Anyway, the next day, the 30th of January, 1649, a large crowd waited for the execution. It was a very cold day. Charles dressed with 2 shirts to avoid shivering and giving the impression of fear. He prayed with his chaplain, Bishop Juxon, until 10 a.m. when there came a knock on his door that the time had come. At this point, under escort of guard, Charles, Juxon, and Thomas Herbert walked across St. James Park to Whitehall to wait for the final call, which would come 3 hours later. What was that like? It's like a dead man walking. It must have been sobering for everybody there, to be sure. I'm wondering, did anybody talk? Did they walk in silence? Was the wind blowing? Was there snow or was there still, dead leaves under their feet? Did it crunch as they walked? And it was mid-morning, so people would have been out. I mean, were the crowds already waiting? Did they see him walking to the castle? When Charles approached the chopping block, he realized it was set low. Now, some believe this was intentional as a low block was used to kill traitors. Anyway, he asked if it might be raised, and the request was rejected. He was, however, granted the right to address the crowd. Of course, they'd been petitioned off so far away that the words were lost to the crowd, but it was recorded, and he said in part, quote, "I never did begin a war with the 2 houses of Parliament, and I call God to witness, to whom I must shortly make an account, that I never did intend for to encroach upon their privileges. They began upon me," end quote. He also used the opportunity to revisit some recent history. He addressed the remonstrance of 1642, the turning of the militia against him. He regretted not doing more to help the Earl of Strafford. He was angry. So he continued, quote, "For the people, truly I desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody whomsoever. But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consist in having of government those laws by which their life and their goods may be most their own. It's not for having share in government, sir. This is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things," end quote. One last declaration of his firm belief in absolute rule. and maybe a little defensive, but quite eloquent for the day and a particular demise that he was about to face. Insolent, tragic, noble, resolute. I go, he continued, from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world. End quote. The king was ready. He had his hair tucked under a white nightcap. He took off his cloak and laid down at the low block. He said a prayer and motioned that he was ready. And the axe fell, and in one quick swing, the head was off, and then raised for all to see. The whole sight was pretty grim. One eyewitness said that there was such a groan by the thousands then present as I never heard before and desire I may never hear again. I wonder in the cold of that day, the crowd facing the wall of the castle, how did the groan sound? The collective groan. Did it carry? What other sounds, if at all, could there have been at that moment in that place? With this, the monarchy was not just declared abolished. For all intents and purposes, it was in England. The murder of Charles, the assassination, did not end the division within England. It did not end the hostilities among the three nations. There would be violence, a lot of violence to come. So cleaning up the Irish-Scottish stuff for a bit, and getting just a little ahead of ourselves here, after the death of Charles I, both the Scots and the Irish would rally around Charles II. And on the 1st of January, 1651, he was crowned the King of Scotland. The Irish exited the stage when the Parliamentarians defeated them in August of 1649, and we'll talk about that next time. The Third Civil War saw Oliver Cromwell invade Scotland in July of 1650. They had a huge victory at Dunbar on the 3rd of September. The Scots rebounded and they invaded England, going for London, but they failed. And on the 3rd of September, in 1651, Oliver Cromwell was victorious at Worcester. Charles II fled to France. And at this point, Oliver Cromwell owned England. So what did that look like, you may ask? Well, there would be misery under the dictatorship that was coming. And there would be a restoration of the Stuart monarchy after that. And with that, vengeance on the Regicides. Most of the 59 men who signed the death warrant of Charles I would one day answer to Charles II. Some from the grave. Many would have their lives upended. They would be spread across Europe. And some would seek refuge in Puritan New England. And Charles would leave his mark on those colonies. But those are stories for another day. And until then, I hope our time together this day has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.